Welcome to the Scandinavian Mind podcast, where every week we talk about how technology is transforming the creative industries. Today on the program, can resell save fashion? This has been one of the hottest topics in the fashion community, and it's picking up speed in the wake of the sustainability debate. Today we will talk about the state of the secondhand fashion, the difference between vintage and resell, what the data says about vintage shopping, which brands are the hottest for resell, is vintage shopping becoming the new fast fashion, and the potential for blockchain in the resell market. And we'll end with the program with our personal favorites within resell and vintage. I'm Konrad Olsson, editor-in-chief and founder of Scandinavian Mind, and I'm here with my dear colleagues Roland, Philippe, Kretzschmar, editor-at-large, and Erik, Sedin, our junior editor. Guys, how are you?
Fantastic.
Love the intro, Konrad. Long intro. Great show. A lot of topics.
We have almost too much to talk about. Guys, I want to begin with, and answer this without saying where you bought it, but when is the last time you bought a second-hand or vintage garment? September? So 2 months ago, Erik?
About half a year ago.
Half a year ago, okay. I think mine was a spree in September, or no, in October actually. It's pretty recent. Interesting. Okay, we'll get into this later, and I want to end the program with our personal recommendations where we find our vintage garments. All right, so there are like 10 million ways we can enter these topics. When we talked about this up on the program, there's like 5 different angles, so maybe there will be several programs. But to begin with, this is obviously an interesting topic because the number of resale platforms are growing, and the amount of garments that is produced every year globally is so huge that according to data company Edited, it's expected that by 2030 we'll be throwing away 134 million tons of textiles. So this if everything progresses as it is, and we don't start recycling the way we should, we're looking at huge numbers of clothes. We've talked before on the program that we don't know how many clothes are produced every year in the world. It's somewhere between 80 and 130, 150 billion garments. So obviously there's huge volume of fashion out there. So I thought we'd start by just sorting out the terminology here a little bit. There's we talk about vintage clothing, we talk about secondhand clothing, we talk about resell. A term like pre-loved is being used quite a lot in the industry. But guys, do you know what the difference between vintage and just secondhand is?
I think from my research or from my understanding is that secondhand could be something that came from last year's wardrobe. It's just it's pre-worn. If it's more than 10 years old, it's vintage because it's probably gonna look vintage.
If it's older than you, Erik, then it's definitely vintage.
Yeah, exactly. I saw some articles saying that it had to be from the 80s, so that beats me by a mile.
80? No. That's I'm sure 90s got to be vintage,
exactly,
right?
Yeah, that's what I think too. And I also
beginning or late 90s. My take is that vintage it's when it's a generation old.
Interesting. So I've heard also many different definitions. There's a website called vintageinformation.com that says the most commonly accepted industry standard is it needs to be at least 20 years old. But what you're saying, though, Erik, is very interesting. And there is, I think, when the term resell, if we're talking about that, that's something that's much more commonly used. I think the term secondhand is I rarely see that used in marketing or terminology. If you look at some of the biggest platforms like Grailed and Vestiaire and so forth, they use the term resell or sometimes like pre-loved, but no one uses the term secondhand. So I think the term resell has been established also by the sneaker community. Is this something that you see as well, Roland?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I mean, it's just cosmetics, to be honest. It's just making secondhand sound sexier. At the end of the day, if we're talking about selling secondhand objects, it is secondhand, right? I mean, but if you talk about resell, it's a sexier way to say secondhand. But then on the other hand, we discussed this, kind of warming up discussion before the show today. What's the difference between resell and vintage or secondhand? It's like if you resell a pair of unworn sneakers, they are not vintage, they're not secondhand, or are they? I don't know. If it are a 20 pair of unworn in the box sneakers, they're vintage, but they're not secondhand.
That's what they call dead stock in the industry.
Stock.
If it's
Yeah,
dead
exactly,
stock,
yeah.
unused, yeah.
Yeah. So I get a bit confused. I guess consumers get even more confused. I got even more confused doing some research. Like the textile industry is about $150 billion in turnover globally, and the second-hand market is valued at $200 billion, more than the textile industry. So obviously, in second-hand, you put in a lot of other things, not only clothing, right?
Oh yeah, obviously.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think for me it has to be worn for it to be secondhand and vintage.
Yes.
Because when you think about it, if it was never worn, like you said about those sneakers, that means that it has used natural resources when it's been made. It's been packaged in plastic and it's been shipped everywhere. And also probably when you resell, it's been shipped another time, perhaps even if you buy it off StockX or stuff. So I guess like people use this as like a sustainability, like a greenwashing thing. Time doesn't take away like CO2 emissions, right? Just because it's been in a box for 30 years, like, oh, it's vintage, it's resale, but still, all those natural resources, all that stuff, packaging it, that already happened,
Sure, but I mean, one could argue also that if you use something that's already produced, not of this season, it's something that's been produced before, even if it's 5 years ago, 10 years ago, whatever it is, that's better for the planet than something that's produced for this season.
Well, you could argue against that. So basically, you could say that what is produced today, if it's not used for 20 years, it's great. But that's not true, right?
If it's still this, of course, this is semantics. What's happening in the industry today, and there was a huge big article on Bloomberg Business Week just the other week about how textile waste and garment waste is handled globally. So in the UK, for example, 80% of the 300 tons of clothing that's donated to charity is incinerated. And according to data from the US Environmental Protection Agency, the amount of clothing and footwear waste generated in the US reaches up to roughly 13 million tons per year. And, about 70% of that ends up in landfills. And this article explained how we see one of the biggest importers of textile waste is places like Ghana, Ukraine, Nigeria, Kenya, Tanzania, and so forth. And what we see is that even though we have these bins of, in places like H&M and Zara and so that kind of places where they collect garments supposedly to be resold to other people, most of that is not resold. It is bundled together and shipped to these countries and ending up in landfills. Some of it is being repurposed into like stuffing for cars and furniture and so forth. But it's such a huge amount of waste that's being just ended up in landfills. So, there's a long-winded way of saying if a garment is used, that's the best garment, no matter how old it is or not. But the big problem in the world right now is we produce too much that we're not using. We don't need it.
Yeah.
That's the gist of it.
Okay, but I think what is still confusing to me, and maybe you can help me out here, Konrad, what's the difference then with resell?
There's no difference at all. I think secondhand, vintage, and resell, that's just the same term.
But
The different terminology for the same
thing. New thing, right? If we talk about StockX, right? They're selling vintage sneakers and new sneakers, unboxed, right? So, but they are reselling, right? But they are not reselling used products. They're reselling new products.
Yeah, of course. And think of it this way. I'm on a raffle. I get these amazing Travis Scott Jordans that everyone wants. They get sent to they're made in China somewhere, blah, blah, blah. They get sent to me in Sweden, then I resell them on StockX. They get sent to the US, and then maybe someone from Vietnam buys them from StockX. It's like, oh, it's resale. I bought it resale. doesn't mean it's better for the environment. Even if it's from last week or from 2 years ago, like I said, it's still used natural resources. It was still shipped. It was still made. All that stuff. So resale, that's kind of the question here for the podcast. Can it save fashion? Can it be sustainable? Yes, if it's used. That's like the easy.
Yeah, but so this is interesting because in our research prior to this show, we looked at resale, or reselling, and the flipping element is much talked about, right? That the reselling platforms are used for flipping sneakers, watches, art, you name it. And then it is labeled, as you say, as being kind of a more sustainable alternative to shopping. But in reality, it's probably not. Because the majority of the high value resold items, sneakers for hundreds of thousands of Swedish kroner, or art or watches for millions, they are never used. They are untouched, new in their boxes, and just shipped, as you say, all over the world again and again and again, never used, and just harmful to the environment, right?
I don't know if you heard about Reflaunt. It's a worldwide reselling platform and service. So a lot of big fashion brands use this service for people to resell their stuff. And I read in September, I read a Haisnobaiti article about how Balenciaga launched their big resale program. And according to them, it's to become fully sustainable, right? That's the way they're using it. So you can drop off your Balenciaga clothes that you bought or that you own at a store, or you get them picked up at home, and they document it, they authenticize it, they professionally photograph it, they price it, and then they list it on this Reflaunt website. So once your bag or your shoes or whatever you've given them or sold, you're then compensated either by some cash from Balenciaga, they buy it from you, or they give you Balenciaga credit value, so you can use your money to buy more Balenciaga stuff. So I did some research and I found out that the payout value, for using the credit value at Balenciaga stores is 20% higher than if they would just give you the cash. So for them, it's like, oh, we're starting a circular process. Now, this actually sounds like a good idea, right? It's a brilliant idea if we only talked about how it's profit-driven or community-driven, because I wouldn't call this sustainably driven. It's basically greenwashing. Because I read a comment under the article that I thought was really interesting. It's from the user Danny. Well, it said, "This is purely profit-driven. If anyone thinks this is about the environment, they're wrong. The brand will buy back what it sold to you for a fraction of what you paid and resell it to another customer who couldn't afford it at full price, at a higher price than they sold it to you. And incentivizing you to take a shop credit means you're profiting again when you buy another thing you didn't need." So Balenciaga, it's this way that they probably sent out this press release like, we're becoming fully sustainable, but still they're thinking of this idea of you need to buy more stuff, we need to consume more. It's consumerism in a different term.
And what's interesting then, in addition, is that the highest value items, regardless of industry, are, as you say, dead stock Konrad or new out of box, or so they are encouraging people not to use the products to increase the value on the resale market. Basically, that's how the mechanism works, right?
Yeah.
So you would get the highest value of your Balenciaga item if it's less used, right, in this program.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's really interesting.
And you know what I mean? Like we said before, if it's used, it's great. If you bought a Balenciaga shirt or a shoe or a bag for 10 years ago and you used it and then you give it to them like, hey, take this, they will price it accordingly. But if it's like a really hyped bag that, I don't know, some celebrity wears at the red carpet somewhere that's vintage, they will know, oh, you still have the tag on it, we're going to price it really high. And then Balenciaga takes the money and then it keeps on going. So if it's used, it's great. But I'm not sure if that's what Balenciaga is doing. I don't think they're committing to being fully sustainable by doing this. Now, it's a great business idea. I think it's amazing.
And there are many examples of those platforms, right? And I think even the outdoor industry, I remember Arc'teryx, they launched a resale program a couple of years ago, quite similar to the Balenciaga one. And in the outdoor industry, being sustainable is so business critical. You look at Patagonia as the key example. But basically, as you say, I mean, they are encouraging you to spend more within the brand ecosystem.
Yeah, I think any brand operating right now, any of the bigger brands, they have to start moving into this space somewhat. And it's kind of like is it greenwashing, green hushing, whatever it is. Uh, not doing it is not an alternative either. So they have to take responsibility for the things they put out there. But we're so far away from it being circular. I mean, the fashion industry is by definition, I think, probably the least circular industry in the world. We know that 1% of everything that's produced is being recycled. That's, to me, if 99% of what's produced is not being recycled, it's far away from being circular. All right, so one other way to look at this topic is generationally. And, one reason we're seeing the rise in secondhand, vintage, resell, whatever you want to call it, is that new generations find it much more natural to buy clothes that have been worn before. So there was a study coming out, a Swedish study came out and saying that, the younger generations, Gen Z, one of four consumer consider secondhand as their first choice when they're buying something, whereas there's a huge difference from Gen X and so-called boomers, where it was around 5% that preferred secondhand. So there is a huge attitude shift, and I think we're going to see, once these generations grow older and they see it's much more natural to buy vintage or secondhand stuff, there is going to be a market opportunity there. We're going to have to service that market as well. And there's going to be plenty of clothes to service them with, so to speak. And again, I mean, the biggest problem with the fashion industry is the overproduction. We were producing too much stuff. And there was a report out, I believe, Erik, you were at the launch of this. The Swedish Fashion Council launched a report, and they lifted secondhand as one of the key factors for transforming the fashion industry.
Yeah, it was on. We're recording this on Wednesday, and the Swedish Fashion Council held a panel talk on Wednesday. There was a guy there from McKinsey. He was a partner at McKinsey. His name is Jonathan Janmark, and he said, I thought it was interesting. He said that he predicted that in 2023 it will be the first ever volume drop in fashion because of many things. Could be because of the thing you mentioned now, could be because the right people are growing up or whatever. But he mostly said it's because of the macroeconomic situation right now. So in 2023,
mind-blowing to me.
It is, yeah.
If that's true, and I bet that's a prediction on his part, but that would be a major shift in the fashion industry. If that,
but then of course it could be just happened this year, and then in 2024 it goes up again. It still is too much volumes produced, even though it's less than the year before. You read it before. We produce so much. We don't know if it's 80 billion garments or 150. So still a very interesting take from him, and maybe it aligns with what we're saying here. And I don't want to speak for my generation now, but what you were talking about, how I've noticed this. If I give someone a compliment on their shirt or their jacket or whatever, I realized that it's kind of cool to kind of shrug and be like, if I ask them, that's a great shirt, where's it from? And, just going, oh, I don't know, it's secondhand. That's kind of a cool way of answering. But it's even cooler, I would say, to say, oh, this is vintage Prada or something. Because that means that you found it, like, it's a steal. I found it somewhere. And, this is for brands to take care of. People actually like to, having the vintage prefix, that's cool for people of my generation. That's my view, at least. Spokesperson of Gen Z has spoken, but brands take use of that. Find your old clothes and sell them.
But, it's super interesting to do predictions with numbers, right? Just kind of looked into some additional research while recording this, and actually looking at now the second-hand apparel market is estimated at $71 million in 2022. Okay, $71 million. And the textile market it's valued at 150 billion.
Yeah, it's
right?
just a fraction. It's a fraction of it. Yeah.
And it's estimated by the Future Market Insight Institute that There is a CAGR of 14% from 2022 to 2032, reaching a valuation of $282 million in 2032. So in 10 years from now, it's going to be valued at 282 million, right? Still, 1 billion is 1,000 million. And the total textile market is 148 or 150 billion in this year, right? So I mean, honestly, it looks really, really, really dark.
All right, guys. So there's obviously a ton to talk about, and let's keep this conversation going in future episodes. I wanted to end with a kind of a personal reflection on our own shopping habits and give our own recommendations. And just to carry on what you said, Erik, one of the things that has been driving me into buying more and more vintage is the act of discovery. When you travel today and go to a new city in Europe, it looks the same everywhere. High street, Main Street, wherever you buy, it's kind of the same stores, the same everywhere. If you are a fashion consumer, you've seen the pictures, you've seen the clothes. It's very hard to find discovery of new clothes and new brands. But I've found, at least my personal reflection, is that when I go into a vintage store in Helsinki or Amsterdam or Milan, I can find completely different, inventory of clothes. And to me, that's a new type of discovery. When I started buying clothes like 15 years ago, going into fashion, it was like an exploration going to New York, because you had all these stores that you didn't exist in Sweden. But today it's like everything is available all the time. Before I give my best takes, Erik, where do you buy your vintage fashion?
I have two subway stops from my apartment. There's it's called Stadsmissionen, and then literally on the other street, it's called Emmaus. Maybe for international listeners, could be kind of a Salvation Army secondhand. It's
OG secondhand. That's real secondhand. That's not even. That's not resell or pre-love. That's just secondhand.
No. And it's cheap. It's incredibly cheap. That's why I go there, and I really love it, because me and my girlfriend go there. One of us always walks out with something. For example, this shirt that I'm wearing right now. But that's where I go. And actually, I see Konrad. I've been seeing you strolling into the office with your Carhartts and your, with the paint splatter and the carpenter pants, which is very, going back to your point about how now that you go to high streets all over the world, it all looks the same. Right? Now, I actually think, like, for me, the thing that's in now, that's trendy, has been for a year. It's the Arc'teryx jacket from like the 90s. That people buy for a lot of money because it looks cool. They buy it oversized, they snuggle it at the bottom, and then they get the carpenter pants. Extra bonus points if there's some colors on there, maybe like a rip or something from Carhartt or from Dickies. That's even for secondhand places. That's trendy now, So even if you go to, that's what I've been seeing when I went to Amsterdam. I was there a couple of weeks ago. I walk into the secondhand shop. That's what they put closest to the door, for the kids to see. The carpenter pants and the Gorbcore jackets. So could be that even the secondhand ones, wherever you go in the world, looks the same.
But can I plug that my last shopping spree was on Vestiaire? Yeah, does that count? So some Hermes scarves on Vestiaire. There you go.
That's a good recommendation. That in Vestiaire, that's where my wife does most of her vintage shopping as well. But Erik, just like you said, I'm a big fiend for American workwear. I love Broadway and Sons, the best vintage store in Sweden. They started out in Gothenburg, just opened up in Stockholm last year, I think. A bit pricey, but they're just the best on vintage Levi's 501s. There's a funny story with the dad of the current owners buying a huge, enormous amounts of vintage Levi's 501s about 20 years ago, and they're still selling off of that supply. But I also want to plug. I was also recently in Amsterdam, and there was some great vintage shopping there. There's a store called Biss, if you're interested in vintage army wear.
And I see a business opportunity for you, Konrad. So every time you go to the archipelago, every Monday you come back to town with new clothes that you can sell, with new fresh paint on it. It's great.
Yeah, that's my fallback plan for sure. Guys, this has been a great conversation on vintage, resell, secondhand, and whatever else we call it. Just before we end up here, I just want to plug a few things that are happening on ScandinavianMind.com. We have a story out this week by Johan Magnusson, our senior editor, where he has interviewed a series of lifestyle industry executives that share their expertise on how to go from a sustainable brand to a B Corp certification. Huge topic within the industry, and we decided to go all in on that this week. Guys, what's happening until next week? What are you looking forward to?
I just want to say big up to Roland, who taught us the B Corp word, maybe like season 1 of the show. So we know, early listeners know about B Corp. You know what it's all about.
What can I say? I'm still into art. This weekend in Stockholm, every gallery is open. It's like this gallery weekend in Stockholm. It's a lot of happenings, free wine everywhere you go, good art, cool people. So yeah, art.
Personally, I'm taking the train tomorrow up to Sundsvall to visit the opening of the new factory by Renewcell, the textile recycling plant that's opening there. Super excited about that. I'm sure we'll revisit that online and on this podcast.
Super interesting.
Yeah, definitely. I'm super excited about seeing that. All right, guys, this has been the Scandinavian Mind podcast. Don't forget to follow us on TikTok, Instagram, LinkedIn, and subscribe to our newsletter. Visit scandinavianmind.com/newsletter. Till next week, goodbye.
Ciao.
See ya.